everyone. I'm Rachel here with Ari, and we're your hosts for the Merry Writer podcast. This week, we're on episode 210, asking our guest, why is writing for children important? Before we dive into the topic, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening if you haven't already. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with friends and feel free to write a review.
Now, please help us welcome Darlene Foster to the show. Darlene, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a real big fan of the Merry Writer podcast.
Oh, that's always nice to hear that people actually listen to it. we don't even listen to it. When we should. We probably should.
Shh, don't give away our secrets.
Before we go any further, would you like to tell everyone why you chose to discuss writing for children as a topic?
Well, I write for children. And for me, writing for children is important because I loved reading as a child, and I want other kids, modern kids, to enjoy reading and get the same love of books that I had when I was a child. Because that's where reading starts. It's when you're a kid, for the most part. And I think that children's books create lifelong readers. I mean, if you start reading when you're little, in the cradle, almost, you're going to always want to read. I always have a book with me because I always did. And so to me, children's books are really important. And that's why I became a children's writer. Well, that and because I've never really grown up. But there's lots of children's books out there. And I think that's really important. And of course, studies have proven that children who read are usually more successful. And there's the whole thing about, being read to as a child and the good feeling you have. I know one time I was at a business meeting, and our boss at our break decided to read to us, like a novel, not business thing. He read from a book while we were having our coffee and tea. And it just brought all these memories back of being read to. And we all, felt really good and then had a really successful meeting. So yeah, I just think children's books are really important.
That's actually really amazing how your work did that, because what a unique way to connect with everybody in the room. I love that. That's amazing. And I have to agree with you. Reading as a child is super important because that's the foundation for everything. And their minds are like sponges. No matter what they hear, see, read, they remember it and they learn, and it's so easy for them. And I agree, like reading from a young age is super, super important. And I lost that growing up. I read with my parents and it was fun. I listened to audiobooks. Then as I got older and school started assigning books that I didn't care about, I totally lost the interest in reading. So there is like this fine line of it. And I find it's really important when writers write for children, there's like this certain niche for it. You really need to cater it for the children with a specific purpose in mind, but also to be entertaining.
For sure. And I think a good teacher knows what the children will like and will assign books that children like, because all the books I had to read in school, I absolutely loved. But I think I had teachers that went, okay, now this group of kids will like this book, you know? So maybe I was just lucky, but I haven't met many books I didn't like.
Well, that's good though. We had to do summer reading in some of the books. It was written for the age group, but the content matter like went right over my head 9 times out of 10. But also I'm a slow reader to begin with anyway. So
No, I'm a slow reader too.
Could
Yeah,
factor into it.
You see, what you said about being read to, that resonated with me a lot, because when I was younger, I actually struggled to read. I was quite bad with learning. And I don't know how, but later on, I obviously picked it all up and everything. But they used to have these books that you would read, and it's like in primary school and infant school, and they would start with like, it was pink book, then red, then orange, and you went all the way up the rainbow to like gold and silver. And the point was, by the time you were about to go to high school, you should have been reading gold and silver. That was the level. And I was like on green. and I struggled really hard with reading. But the reason I still love books was because my older sister would read to me at night. She would read The House at Pooh Corner, by A.A. Milne. And because I had someone reading to me, because I couldn't read myself, I was struggling so hard with it. Because I had someone reading for me, it kept the interest in stories and books alive, so that as I managed to overcome the difficulties and get better, and thankfully moved on to a bit, I can actually read really well, and to the point where I'm writing my own. um, it made it easier to then pick up books later. Whereas I think if I hadn't had someone reading to me and I'd have just been struggling, it would have been seen as a chore and a difficulty and an obstacle, and I probably wouldn't have enjoyed it, and I probably would have given it up. So reading to someone is so important as well, especially if they're younger.
I completely agree with that. And picking the right reading material. So many times parents will say something, oh, my kids don't like to read. And basically it's because you're not showing them the right stuff. I'm just going to read a brief little thing that somebody emailed to me, which made me feel really good. She said, my 12-year-old granddaughter just finished your books. She loved them. We were camping and we kept telling her to put the books down and come and play. This is the first time I have ever seen her get so excited about a book. Your books have given her a love of reading. Thanks for the good reads.
That's so sweet. Oh,
Yeah. But and so if you ask why do I want to write for kids? Well, there's your answer.
yeah, you just like made a huge impact on that
That is
child. Oh,
lovely.
that's so
Oh,
And
nice.
and the point is it's because she liked
wow.
the subject matter. And so if you can find, even and my son didn't read much. I read to him. I read to both my kids. He had a bit of a learning disability, just a slight one, and reading didn't come easy for him. Um, but the teacher said to me, get him to read anything, even comic books. And so we got comic books and we read them together, and he slowly now he reads. He loves reading biographies and autobiographies. So, you know,
I like the path from comic books to autobiographies and things. It's like that's quite different.
I know, I love that too.
Well, it's funny because, like, Ari, the memory that you shared with you and your sister, you just made me remember that my older sister used to read to me. She loved reading the Archie comics, and because I wasn't reading the words at all, she would read it to me, and whenever a question mark would be above a character's head, that was my cue. So she would be reading, and I would go, "Huh?" And that like, that's how So, yeah, that I completely forgot about that. Yeah, man, it's so important, and and the reading aside, it makes such great memories, and it's such an awesome bonding moment too. But speaking of content within children's books, Darlene, are there any typical themes that can be found in children's books?
Well, the big one for me is friendship. I think that well, friendships are important to children, even if they don't have friends. The shy kids, they would like one or some. And so I think friendship is a big one as a topic in books. And I'm thinking back to the old books like Anne of Green Gables, which was my favorite book. And I still read it, actually. I still reread it. Anne Shirley and Diana Barry. That friendship was just so special. They called each other soulmates, and which has become a buzzword again. Or even the Harry Potter books. Friendship's a really big theme in those books, and you're going to find that in a lot of books for children, and I think that's a big one. And the other one would be family relations, whether it's a good family relation, with a mom and dad that get along and are good to the children, or the dysfunctional families. And you'll find a lot of the books nowadays are about dysfunctional families. I read a lot of middle grade books in particular, and a lot of them have that theme of single parents, of blended families, of course, parents that are still together but don't get along, even books with abusive parents, that sort of thing, because it's reality nowadays. It is. And I'm not saying it didn't happen before, but it's certainly talked about more. And I think it's good that it's in books because kids can read the books and go, oh, it happens in other families too. It's not just my family, or it's not just me. Because, kids, they always think everything's their fault. Dad drinks because I'm a bad kid, or mom and dad are getting a divorce because of me. And this is what happens with children. So if they read books with very real family relations happening, they feel better about themselves, I think. At least that's my take on it too. I don't know if you know an author named Eric Walters. He's a Canadian author, but he's quite prolific, and he wrote a book. His books are all great, but I just loved one of his latest ones called The King of Jam Sandwiches. And he's the main character is a young boy, about 12, and he's raised by his dad, a single dad, but the dad has mental health issues. I believe he's bipolar or something. And so this young boy really has to fend for himself a lot of times, and sometimes look after his dad. And at the end of the book, Eric writes just a little blurb that it's somewhat based on his life story or his childhood. But when I read it, I thought, oh, there's so many kids that will be able to identify with this character. Yeah. So those are some of the themes. I'm seeing more and more diversity in books now too, which I think is great. You didn't used to so much, but the last five 10 to 5 years, I think I'm seeing more and more diversity, blended families where there's different cultures within one family, situations like that, which I think is really good as well, because that's what's going to help us make this world a better place, is if we all understand that we're all different, but in some ways we're all the same as well. So those are probably the three biggest themes that I'm seeing nowadays. I hope that answered your question, actually.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you answered it plus more. That was great. Because I agree with you. When you're a kid, friendship and your family dynamic, like that's the most important thing to you because that's kind of really all you know. Kids are kind of in their own little circle. They go to school, they may have a sports activity, and then they go home. There's no work, there's no coworkers, there's none of that. So I get that to have the content matter be relatable to them, it makes them want to read more because they want to learn more about the characters and they want to relate and say, oh, if this character was able to get over this hurdle that I'm currently facing, then I can get over this hurdle too. And it's just, I think it's such an encouraging thing for children.
It's like I can't remember the quote. I probably should have remembered the quote, but I don't. Something like, um, you don't say that there isn't dragons. The books teach kids that they can defeat the dragon. And that's the concept. It's like having those themes in there, especially like things like friendship. If you're an anxious kid, a shy kid, someone who struggles, reading a book that shows how friends get meet up, like you mentioned the Harry Potter. I haven't read it. I saw the movie. I haven't read the book. But those three weren't friends. They didn't meet, didn't know each other. So you got to see how they became friends. Now, obviously, I know there's books where you meet them and they're already friends, like Lord of the Rings. Sam and Frodo were friends already. But it kind of helps having those. So, like, if you're a shy kid, if you're a kid who would struggle, reading a book and seeing, like, oh, that's how they made friends. They just went up to the kid that was sitting on their own and said hi. They offered them part of their sweets. They offered to help them with some sort of part of their homework. And it can help because then they go, oh, maybe I can try that because it worked in the book. And I do remember reading some books that had kind of like friendship circles and how to deal with it. And also if friendships broke down, how to fix them. Because we all do that, don't we? When we were little, you'd fall out over the stupidest thing, and then it'd be like the end of the world, and you didn't want to deal with it. And that, so having a book that's sort of like, oh wow, they fell out. Oh, okay, 4 chapters later, they're friends again. It's like, all right, well, maybe we can be friends again. It's like,
That's a really good point. And I do have in my Amanda books, a secondary character is Leah. And every now and then I do have them fall out over, and usually, as you say, something quite silly or a difference of opinion or something. And then of course they become friends again. I think that's a universal situation, isn't it? So to make it real, to make a book real, I think that's important to have that in there. Good point, Ari. I like that.
It is important to have that, but it also makes me really sad. I don't like it when the characters fight. Even if they do make up in the end, it makes me sad, which is good in a way because again, it's relatable and it also adds emotion, which is good, but yeah.
I think that's good
But
because that
doesn't it make you then want to turn the page and see if they do make up?
yes.
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
That's it.
See, it
It keeps
keeps it
it
going.
going.
It
If
does.
everything is lollipops and roses all the time, the kids are going to close the book and watch TV or play a video game. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. You still need in the end, it's still a writer's job to put the conflict in there, and it's just like it might not be, something really intense like you might get in a sci-fi, but you still have to have those conflicts like, wow, they're not friends anymore, and the new teacher's really mean and things like that. So yeah, you do still need them. And with that said, I'm going to go to my question. How can you make sure the stories are appropriate for the specific age ranges?
Yeah, and that is something I have to constantly be aware of, that I'm writing this book for children. I have to switch my adult brain off, which by the way isn't hard for me, um, and um, and go into child mode or middle grade mode or tweens as we call them, because yeah, they think different and they're interested in different things, and then they have to be appropriate as well. I mean, there's certain things that we can say to our friends as adults that certainly is not appropriate to put in a book, right? Now there are guidelines. You can check things like this out on the internet. There's lots of guidelines actually over that, but a lot of it is just common sense. You think about things like, what was it like when I was a kid? What was I introduced to and familiar with that, and what was I not? Also, think if you have your own kids, is this a book you'd want your kids to read or your grandkids or your nieces or your nephews? I think that's a good way to say, no, I remember when I wrote the first book and I had said they'd gone to visit a camel ranch, and I said that Amanda could smell camel shit. And my publisher said, you can't put that in a children's book. And I thought, now I'm from a farm. We said that all the time. But, she's looking at universal kids, kids from the city, kids that, are not familiar with this word unless it was used as a bad word, which I wasn't thinking of it that way. So I changed it to camel poop, of course. So, I mean, some kids will hear swearing at home. Lots of dads will be working away and bang their thumb with the hammer and swear. And kids will hear this, but you still can't put it in a child's book. Not if you want everyone to buy it, because don't forget, it's the moms and the teachers and the librarians and the dads and the aunties that buy the books. And some of them, if they see even one swear word, they won't pick it up. So it's important to use appropriate language for children. Okay, yeah, but I did hear one author speak about, and his name is Lawrence Hill, right? He writes adult books for the most part, but he did recently write a child's book. And but he said not to sugarcoat everything. Like children are tough and they can take things. Like I did talk about suicide in one of my books. It was just the one of the characters, one of the minor characters, did have some mental health issues. She suffered from anxiety, and there was a little bit, not much, but just a little bit about suicide that had happened in her family, and that's why she was anxious. And I wondered if I should keep it in there or not. And then I heard this author speak about this, and he was saying, you got to put some of the tough stuff in because kids, that's how they learn to deal with tough stuff is by reading. So there is a fine line, but again, I guess you really need to use your common sense. But real life has death, it has illness, it's got bullying. Bullying is in a lot of books nowadays as well. Sadness, grandparents die in books, sometimes the parents die in a book, kids are orphans, that sort of thing. So I think that reading about these things help children deal with issues. Um, my first experience with death was when Bambi's mom got shot, and I cried myself to sleep. Oh my goodness, I think I cried for a week, but I was going to encounter it again in my life, So yeah, I'm not quite sure if I quite answered your question, but that's my take on making sure that children's books are appropriate for the age group. And yes, I write for middle grades. I'm not writing young adult where you can the boundaries are a lot wider in young adult. And then if I was writing picture books, again, it would be a little bit more simpler concepts.
I think that was great, seriously, because I know I find it difficult. I don't have children, but I do have a niece and nephew, and I struggle. Sometimes I'll see things and I'm like, oh, I don't think that's appropriate. And then I'll look back going, oh, wait, I remember I was reading things like that at their age, or I was doing this or that. And it's weird how when you get to like as you get older, you kind of get this weirdness like, oh, that might be inappropriate, that might be bad. But like my first experience of reading about like death and everything was in the Animals of Farthing Woods series because I used to like read a lot of animal books, and there obviously the whole point was the woods was being destroyed and they had to sort of trek across the country to go to an animal reserve, and the hedgehogs on the road, there was a fox hunt, and it was traumatizing, but at the same time it kind of reading it in a book, it kind of stepped you away from it a little bit, but you still got to feel. And same as you, I cried a lot. And then I think the third book in the series had another death, and I cried again at that. But it was kind of good to have those feelings because you need to feel things, you need to know how to regulate your emotions. I mean, that's something that we kind of forget, that you don't just have that as you get older. You have to learn to regulate your emotions. You have to learn to process death and injury and like I mean, like obviously like a death of a car accident is one thing to someone getting ill and it going on a lot longer. You've got to deal with these things, and we do see it with children who have lost parents or have lost grandparents or siblings or friends. And you think, yeah, it is. And yet at the same time, there's that little part of me going, oh, we can't show them that. We can't talk about death or bullying. And it's like, no, yeah, we need to. It is important to at least touch on those subjects and show that there is ways through that they can get past the bullying, that they can recover from the grief. There's nothing wrong with grieving, and you can get through the death of losing someone without, completely falling apart. You are stronger than you think. And all these are really important messages. So yeah, that's a really good point.
I'm actually going to use a couple of TV shows as an example here. I'm going to stray away from books for a second. Did you guys ever watch Boy Meets World or Full House? Or you've at least heard of them? Yeah. I thought those shows were fantastic because they did talk about those types of issues. They talked about death, they talked about sex, they talked about like all of those issues, and they did it in a classy way that educated the viewers, but they weren't too graphic at the same time. And then I feel like the remakes of these shows, Fuller House and Girl Meets World, they sugarcoated a lot. And I nanny, and the girl that I watch, she was watching Girl Meets World, and I was like, "Did you ever watch Boy Meets World?" And she's like, "No, what's that?" I explained it to her, and I was like, Watch it. Watch Boy Meets World. Get rid of Girl Meets World, just watch Boy Meets World." And it was really interesting and kind of disappointing in a way that she was more interested in Girl Meets World than she was in Boy Meets World. And I understand why Girl Meets World is a female protagonist, Boy Meets World is a male protagonist. So right then and there, it was more difficult for her to relate to Boy Meets World. But I think these days we do sugarcoat a lot. So some of the topics that they talked about in Boy Meets World, she was like, why are they being so open about that? Like it kind of like skeeved her out a little bit. And it was just fascinating to see the things that I learned growing up in the 90s, the things that I heard and the things that I shared with friends and family, it's so different nowadays. And there is, I agree with you, there is that fine line, and you need to use your common sense about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate.
Yeah, I think as adults, it's our responsibility to prepare our children, the children in our care, um, for the adult world. I mean, that's part of the job of being a parent, an aunt, an uncle, a teacher. We're preparing them. And so we can't completely sugarcoat everything because once they get into the real world, they're going to go, wow. I didn't know this was going to happen. So but I do find some parents are a little bit quite overprotective these days. So you have to respect that as well.
You do. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, respect is a big portion of it. The other thing I was gonna say is my aunt prematurely died when I was 12, and my cousins were 3 and 1 years old at the time. So for my family, like my mom was their guardian, so they were over the house all the time. They slept over while my uncle was at work and things like that. And now I mean, they're in their early 20s now, and we hang out with them all the time. We're best friends. But I grew up around the subject of death and how to deal with it and how different families could be. So I think it is important that in your books, it is important to like just touch upon those little things, because I would talk to my friends about it and they would be like, why do you keep talking about this? And I'm like, this is what I know. This is my life. And so reading books that actually touched upon those subjects, it was comforting in a way.
That's a good point, actually. Comforting isn't it's strange that certain topics would be comforting, but it's like what you said, Darlene, earlier, that not even just kids, but adults, we all have that moment of going like, is this something that's only happening to me? Am I the only one feeling this way? And then when people start sharing their experiences and talking about incidents that they've been through and situations and events, and then you're like, oh, it's not just me. I'm not the only person who thinks like this. I'm not the only person who feels this way. So it is so important so that we don't have these moments where you're sat alone thinking, wow, there's something wrong with me because I think this way and nobody else does, because you haven't heard anyone say it and you haven't read anything about it. So this is making me all emotional now.
I like how deep this conversation has gone. And I didn't really expect it to go this way, but I'm enjoying it. And I think we sort of touched upon this a little bit, but I'll ask, just speaking of these themes and what goes on in a child's life, how can you make the characters in these books relatable for children?
Well, for me, it's you just hang around with kids. If you hang around with kids, and I do, I love it. And now my children are grown up, but my grandchildren, and I've got a couple of great grandchildren too, are far away. So I don't get to spend a lot of time with them. But you know what? I find other kids. If I'm in the pool and there's a bunch of adults and there's a bunch of kids, guess where I am? I'm with a bunch of kids. Everybody laughs about that. But yeah, I listen to what they say. I watch their mannerisms. I watch how they talk to each other, how they talk to their parents. Because I can't base everything on my childhood, how I was when a kid, because that was a long time ago. And kids have changed. Now, in some ways, they still are the same, but in some ways they're not. So you really do need to spend time with kids. And if you don't have any of your own, just borrow some. There's always kids around. People always need a babysitter once in a while. And you find, and of course, I'm an eavesdropper, but most authors are. So we're in a restaurant, and there's a family sitting there having a meal. And of course, I'm listening to what they're saying. My husband says, what are you doing? Well, I'm just having a listen. I want to hear how the kids talk about to their parents when they're having a meal. And this is how you can make the kids more relatable. And of course, when I do get an opportunity to spend time with the kids in my family, of course, I really do. And if they say something that I think is really neat, I write it in a notebook. So I've got a notebook of things that kids say that I think sounded really neat. And it's funny because I had my 10-year-old grandson. I had spent a few days with him doing research on the next book I was going to write, actually. And he said something really cool. So I wrote it down and I put it in the book. And then my editor went through it and she said, "Oh, a kid wouldn't say that. That's not something a kid would say." And I said, "Well, actually, a kid would say that because my grandson said it." So you see, yeah, I mean, for people that don't hang around with kids, they might think, "Oh, this isn't what kids talk about." It's amazing what kids talk about. I mean, they talk about things you would never think they would talk about. Yeah, especially if they don't think an adult's listening. Oh my goodness, that's for sure. The other thing, of course, is and Rachel, you mentioned it, is watch TV shows where there is modern day kids in. watch movies where there's modern day kids. That'll give you a bit of an idea as well of how kids talk and act. Attend children's events. Um, yeah, so I think just hang around with kids. That's the most important thing to do it. If you're just gonna base it on your childhood, it might not, it might come across, especially, I mean, you two might be okay because it hasn't been that long since you were kids, but it's been a while since I was. So actually, here's a quote, which is, I just think it's perfect. People mistake me for an adult. Perhaps it's my age. I'm not sure.
I love that. I'm gonna have to start using that.
Good. It's a good one. Yeah.
I do agree with you. Yeah, you have to watch. I mean, obviously not in a creepy way. I'll put that little disclaimer in, but you have to watch and listen to children to get a feel for like what they're into these days because it is vastly different from, when I grew up in the 90s. I mean, things aren't everything's so different now. But it is funny because I used to be a preschool teacher, and some of the things that they would come out with, we used to have a notebook in our classroom that we would just write down hilarious things that they said or ridiculous things that they said. And it was just for us. We just thought it was a good laugh and stuff. And speaking of swears, from what we were talking about earlier, one of the kids in the preschool, he heard his parent say the F word, and he came to school and he thought it was the greatest word in the world, so all the kids were saying it, and it was so bad, but it was hilarious at the same time because they didn't know what they were saying. They just thought it was a funny sounding word. It rhymes with duck. It's a great word. Duck's a great word. So yeah, the things that they come out with is almost always left field to an adult, to you, because you don't have the mind of a child anymore. And which, because we lose that along the way, which is really quite sad. But yeah, if you look back into your old childhood, everything is so different. And that's kind of a narrow mindset because your childhood, even though you might have gone through the same things as your friends, you still had very different experiences.
Yeah, I suppose it'll be like lots of things will affect it, won't it? It's like where you grew up, how how your family dynamic worked, even like how well you do at school, because that would put you in different classes, that might put you in different areas. There's so many different things that can have an effect. But I mean, I have read books and I've sat there thinking, "Ooh, you've used yourself as a as an example because it feels odd. It doesn't feel like a modern story of young children today. It feels like something I would have read in the 80s." And you can tell when people have obviously not done the research that you're talking about. And it's like you can read child psychology books and all that, but in the end, there really is nothing better than talking to the actual target audience for the book, who will know what they like and everything, and even learning what books they like and reading those books to kind of like, oh right, why do they like those books? And that would probably help.
Yeah, that was the one thing I forgot to say was obviously read contemporary novels for the age group that you're writing in. And I write for tweens, of course. So, and tweens are interesting because, they're not little kids anymore. They're 8 to 12, 8 to 13, and they're not little kids anymore, but they're not teenagers yet. So, they're sort of why they're called tweens because they're in between. So at one point they can act really quite mature and say very mature things, and the next time they'll turn around and be quite baby-like. So they're an interesting dynamic, which is why I love writing for them. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because once they become teens, of course, then everything's different. I can't, I wouldn't be able to write about teenagers and all their angst and that sort of thing. I don't think I could, anyways.
It's amazing how the brain works because 8 to 12, it's a very awkward age. Like because as you said, you're not a teenager yet, but you're not really a kid, quote unquote, but you are still a kid at the same time. So I get that. But at least at that age, you can also talk to them and ask them what their likes and their dislikes are and what books they're interested in and what they're currently going through. And not every kid is going to open up right away, but it's a great way to open up conversations with them.
You'd be amazed how they will open up, though. And I think it's because a lot of adults are leery to to start a conversation with them. I mean, I was in the pool. Like we live in a complex in Spain where there is a pool that belongs to about 40 of us. And this one grandson, I think he was 7 or 8 years old, from Ireland, really nice little boy. And we're chatting, we're discussing the differences between Norse mythology and Greek mythology. Now, who would have thought a 7-year-old? But he's a young boy that likes studying about this and reading about this. And apparently, he played some video games that were based on Norse mythology and Greek mythologies, which his grandmother explained later. But we're having this really, really almost an adult-like conversation. But then every now and then he'd, talk and say things that were more his age group. But I thought, you know what, if you approach them, it depends on how you approach them. They will open up, and they're very interesting, the things they tell you.
I think that's actually a really good age for one specific thing is because I do actually remember being that age, and I remember you would get like crazy focused on something. Mine was dinosaurs. I would carry the dinosaur book with me, but it wasn't one of these, like big picture book. It was like a mini but encyclopedia, and I would be learning all the weird names they had, and I could tell you all about their bone structures and their habitats, and it was like deep diving into it. And if I found someone who even remotely showed a tiny bit of interest in dinosaurs in that level, not just like which is your favorite, but like the different bone structures of the hips, and they wanted to hear oh my god, I could talk for hours about that. And it was nice having that kind of when you grab something that you were really interested in and somebody showed any interest in hearing it. Because let's be honest, if you're telling your parents, after a while, they get bored of hearing it. And it's like, yeah, that's nice, love. Yeah, yeah. Go play over there. So anyone who even showed it, and having the fact that you get they're at that age where like Rachel said, they're still sponges, they still want to take things in. And if it's something that they're so interested in, they will find out facts that you've never heard of. They will find all the books that they can at the library, and they will get all the details. And it's just stored, ready, waiting for someone to say, so what are you reading there? And that's it. It all comes out like a big wave. And it's perfect.
And it's a wonderful connection too. Like, because that's a conversation they will never ever forget.
I remember that. I remember people being interested and like proper well, maybe they were faking it and I just didn't know. But when they'd ask more questions and you could tell that they were like, wow, they're actually giving me enough time to share rather than just being like, oh, okay, then yeah, go. We're gonna go, bye. And then they're out the door and you're like, oh, I didn't even get to the good stuff. So
That's really great. I love hearing about that, Ari, and that is true. Yeah. Oh no, I could just chew the ear off of any adult that showed any interest in something I was interested in. And even the quiet kids, the maybe nerdier kids that are more interested in just playing their video games or something. If an adult shows some interest, they will open up. Yeah, you're right. And especially books will do that too. And if you see a child reading a book, and that's often how I'll start a conversation. If I see a child reading a book, in a public space or something, and I'll say, "What are you reading?" And it's amazing how kids are still reading the Harry Potter books. I often see a child reading a Harry Potter book and say, Are you enjoying that?" "Yes, yes, I am. Have you read it?" I said, "Oh, yeah, I've read all of them and I've seen the movies more than once." Uh, so books do draw, is a conversation starter in a lot of cases, and especially when there's a generational gap, it can bring people together. Mhm.
I think that's good as well because it's like you can say like, well, what's your favorite part? And if you find out like, oh, these kids all seem to like this action part or this scary part, you're like, oh, okay. So I wouldn't have thought kids would have liked that, but they did. So it kind of opens it up a bit more. And I'm going to do a really, really rough segue into my next question. Just like jam it in there. How can you make a book more impactful for children?
I guess, and we sort of touched on this, but it needs to be relatable. It has to be relevant to them. I think something has to click with them. They have to connect with the main character or the situation. I think more important though, the main character. If there's something The kids in the story should obviously be the main focus always. Adults can be in the peripheral, but adults are not. This is not a book about adults. It's about adults are there to drive them places, and cook them food. But they can't solve the mystery. Um, and so the kids have to be, I guess, the heroes, and have to be the one that solves the problem. So if you think of all the good parts, all the good books, it's the kids that solve it. Yes, there's adults there, and but I think to make it impactful, they have to be able to empathize with the main character. That's my take on it, anyways. I mean, if you going back to the Harry Potter books, why do kids like it? Well, because Harry, wasn't didn't have a happy life, but then he ended up saving the world, and they all want to do that in one way or another, you know. If Harry could get past living with his terrible aunt and uncle under the stairs, then we should be able to deal with our problems too. I'd love to hear what you guys think about that, actually.
I actually like what you said about the character should be the hero, like the kid should be the hero, because one thing that kids go through is that how many times have you heard a child say, "Oh, I can't wait to grow up. When I grow up, I can do this and I can do that and I can eat whatever I want. I don't have to ask permission or wait to have a snack until after dinner." And I mean, kids' lives are hard. They really are. And I don't mean that in a fresh way. Like it's true. Like kids have it rough. And I think when the character is the hero of the story, it kind of shows kids that, oh, I don't have to wait until I'm an adult to make an impact. I don't have to wait until I'm an adult to do X, Y, and Z. I can still do what I want to do. I can still be who I want to be, and so on and so forth.
That's a really good point, actually. I never really thought of it that way. But yeah, that it's just they can just like they see themselves in it enough to push it on. That's like we all remember thinking, oh, I don't want to grow up, and now it's like taxes are coming around. It's like, God, I really wish I was still a kid. I'd have to deal with taxes. But like I remember I read when I was younger, I read the Naughtiest Schoolgirl series by I want to say Enid Blyton. Like and I remember I think it was I didn't fully relate to her, the character, because I think she went to a boarding school. I think her family were quite rich. I never went to a boarding school. I was not rich. But there were certain things like you mentioned the adults. Most of the adults I remember in the books were the obstacles that they had to get round. They were the awkward. They were the things that like stopped her from doing what she wanted to do. And it's weird because I went back a couple of years ago and I reread one of them, and it was proper like, oh, this kid is a brat. Because as an adult, you're looking at it going like, oh, can she not see that their parents are trying their best? The reason they're sending her there is because she's been so bad and she's been so bad and she doesn't need to be. But as a kid, I would never have seen that. It was just, and yet the book itself, it showed the character was quite like precocious and a bit naughty, obviously that's the name of the book. But then she learned to be more empathetic, and she learned to share, and she learned to understand that other people have feelings, and that when she does certain things it affects other people. And it had an impact without being like in your face. It still had this, like, as you're reading it, you're like, oh wow, okay, yeah, I understand why she wanted to eat all the cake, but now she's actually sharing it because that means she gets other people's pieces of cake. But it was, and then it ended up not just being about that. And it was weird reading it as an adult, because I think I would have struggled to write a book like that, because I don't know how you switch off your adult brain to think, well, that's not how a kid would think. So I don't know where I'm going with this point, so I'm just going to end it. But yeah, that's just something in my head.
Yeah, I agree with you that not all the heroes or heroines are perfect, and I don't think they should be because kids aren't perfect. And I did have one reviewer read one of my Amanda books and said that she didn't really like her because she would go off on her own and try and solve these mysteries and stuff, and she should have stayed put because the parents, would have worried about her. And I'm thinking, you're reading this book from an adult's point of view, you know? I mean, if I'm going to write about this nice little girl that does everything she's supposed to, the kids aren't going to read it. know. One of the things Rachel said was about kids wanting to grow up so that they can be more in control of their lives. Uh, this was one of the things my daughter said when she was about 10 or 11. I must have made a meal that she didn't care for. She was a very fussy eater. And I remember her looking at me and saying, I can't wait until I grow up and become a real woman so I can cook, serve, and eat whatever I damn well please. Of course, I remind her about it now. But see, these are the things kids will say.
Right. Yeah. There's no filter. They just say whatever is on their mind, which is a beautiful thing in a weird way, you know? That's so funny.
It is, and it's too bad that we do lose some of that. And I know we try to be more appropriate and stuff, and learn that people do have feelings, as your character did, Ari. But what is it, Neil Gaiman? Just love everything he writes and says. And he said a child wrote to him and said he was thinking of becoming a writer when he grew up. And did Neil think that that was a good idea? And Neil says, I think it's a bad idea. Growing up is a bad idea. Just become a writer.
Oh, I love
That's a good quote.
it.
Yeah, that is
I love
brilliant.
it.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah. I thought, oh, that was great advice. And maybe that's why I enjoy writing for children, because while I'm writing, I get to be a kid again.
That's
You
perfect.
know?
I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why writing for children is important. Get to be a kid again.
Well, Darlene, I think you said it beautifully. In a nutshell, that's why you should write children's books. So it really has been awesome having you on the show. This was such an amazing conversation. I loved it and enjoyed it so much. So before we go, please would you share a little something about yourself with our listeners?
Well, I write a series of travel adventure books for tweens, as I mentioned before, ages 8 to 12. And I enjoy writing for this because it's my favorite age group. They're bright, inquisitive, eager to learn, and lots of fun. As I said earlier, they're in the middle. So they're not little kids, but they're not yet teenagers. So about me, I grew up on a ranch in Alberta, Canada, where my love of reading was instilled. Maybe it was because it was a farm and I didn't have a lot of distractions. So I always had a book in my hand, and I'd always find a little place out in the farm that I could just sit and read my book, and so that mom wouldn't find me and ask me to do chores. But I also was inspired to see the world because I read a lot of books that took place in other countries. I read a lot of books that took place in England. So I really wanted to go to England, which was the first place I visited once I became an adult and flew to another country. I love traveling. I love meeting interesting people like the two of you. And and I like collecting information for my Amanda Travel series. Um, I love spending time with my children and my grandchildren and my now two great grandchildren in Canada. And of course, I enjoy spending time with my husband and my two cute little rescue dogs here in Spain. Their names are Dot and Leah. I have to mention them, of course. So that's just a little bit about me. And thank you so much for having me. This has been a delight. It really has.
oh, for us too, definitely, definitely.
Oh, please, it's been our pleasure. Thank you so, so much. And all of Darlene's links will be in the description below. So please do go check out her work. But in the meantime, we are going to turn it over to you guys. Do you write for children, or do you often read to your kids or read middle grade books or children's books? Let us know your answers in the comments so we can chat about it. And remember, we do release a new episode every Wednesday. Next week, we're discussing how to stretch your word count. So to ensure you don't miss that, please hit the subscribe button on your way out. As always, thank you so much for listening to the Married Writer podcast. We will see you guys next week. This podcast is brought to you by Excessive Caffeine. We drink a lot. The music titled Inspired is by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons 4.0.